Thank you, and thank you for being here. So, I'm going to go straight into this talk so that we may have some time at the end of the talk. Historically and symbolically speaking, 1955 was an impressively Dickensian year in America. It was the year of the opening of Disneyland and on the order from winning pretty much every Oscar and turning Marlon Brando into one of the greatest American icons ever, of the Montgomery bus boycott and of Emmett Till murder. It was also the year in which one of the two most important non-fiction books of that decade came out. I'm referring to Leslie Fiedler's first book titled An End to Innocence, Essays on Culture and Politics, the other book being David Riesman, The Lonely Crowd. Among the articles included in Fiedler's first collection of essays were the following: Come Back to the Raft Again, Huck Honey, his meditation on class, race, and sex in classics American literature, that Ross Posnock has called, quote, the single most important essay ever written about our literature, end quote. Afterthoughts on the Rosenbergs, a hyper-controversial piece in Julius Enniath Rosenberg. Roman Holidays, unpretentious descriptive account of how one Jewish American family tried to keep Passover tradition in Rome, what today we would call a first example of cultural studies. An Italian Pilgrimage, The Discovery of America, essentially a reflection on American literature and modernity. Traditionally, these essays are read separately through the lenses of 1950s Cold War ideology. After all, one might say, what do Huck and Jim have to do with Passover in Italy, right? What if instead they have something to do with Passover in Italy? If that is, we read those essays together as an historically and conceptually intertwined set of pieces whose aim is to move the study of American literature and culture, in which Fiedler's mind at that point represent the most advanced stage of modernity, away from the binarism of the Cold War era and toward what one of his former students, James Cox, has called Fiedler's democratic freedom. Cox did not define what he meant by it, but the way I see it, Fiedler's democratic freedom identifies the interconnection of four theoretical presuppositions of those aforementioned essays. These are the following: the subversive power of literary criticism, putting class, gender, and race at the center of American literature in 1948 through the essay Come Back to the Raft Again, Huck Honey. Otherness, performing Jewishness by observing a Jewish holiday in the capital of Christianity in Roman Holiday. A transnational reading of national literature in Italian pilgrimage. And finally, the refusal to replace ideology and identity with the state in Afterthought on the Rosenbergs. This theoretical structure will fuel the thematic combination that Fiedler would pursue and develop in the next 40 years of his critical work, from Love and Death in the American Novel in 1960 to The Tyranny of the Normal in 1996, via such books as The Return of the Vanishing America in 1969, The Stranger in Shakespeare in 1972, and Freaks in 1978. Where does this theoretical structure that democratic freedom originates from? This is a question worth asking, I think, especially if one considers that one of the many letters that helped shape the reading of American literature had no formal training whatsoever in the latter. My view is that the origins of Fiedler's democratic freedom can be found in the letters that he wrote during World War II daily to his family, while serving as a cryptologist and translator of Japanese in the Navy from 1943 to 1945. Specifically, I'm going to show how Fiedler's intellectual development during this war period outside the United States, which resulted in encounters with indigenous people, Pacific Islanders, Chinese, and Japanese, as well as the original American outsiders, African Americans, here in the guise of the black servicemen, shaped his approach to humanism and helped him develop previously mentioned theoretical presuppositions. The letters, in fact, are the byproduct of a young man who simultaneously observes, dissects, and in a rather unique way participates to the war, including one of its most concrete and symbolic moments, the Battle of Iwo Jima. They reflect a person who lives and experiences the war as it occurs and unfolds literally in front of his eyes, both from a distance and up close. They're also the record of a unique experience in the continental US, the re-establishment of the Naval Japanese Language School in Boulder, and the history of code breaking, a seldom remembered and taught chapter of World War II, and the culture of our country. Where the historical and cultural aspects intersect is in the gradual, factual, in the sense of experiential, recognition of the encounter with the unknown, which often in a war is the enemy, triggers the discovery and the transformation of oneself, individual as well as collective. This form of understanding is the ultimate attainment of the self. For Fiedler, this is the point when one starts finding his or her way home, the tool he uses to frame both the idea of war and of his own war experience. Writing letters home thus becomes for Fiedler the encounter with and the discovery in the unknown, whether this be geographical, cultural, or human. Conversely, such an encounter becomes a form of self-discovery and liberation from one's own worst enemies, including one's biases, prejudices, and shortcomings. In Fiedler's case, this process started as he arrived in Boulder, Colorado, in December 1942, the new site of the U.S. Navy School of Japanese Language. Originally located in Tokyo in the early 1920s as the Navy School of Oriental Languages, the school had been a dysfunctional institution in the years leading up to beginning of World War II, graduating only a handful of poorly proficient students. The school reinvention with a new name, Navy Japanese Language School, was spearheaded at the beginning of 1941 by Arthur McCollum, director of the Office of Naval Intelligence, Far East Asia section, and especially Canadian-born Commander Albert Hindmarsh, and a brilliant woman named Florence Wall, an associate professor of Japanese at UC Berkeley, where the new school opened in 1941 before relocating to Boulder in the early part of 1942. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor made even more urgent the need to recruit on a voluntary basis trustworthy and intellectual brilliant personnel capable of quickly learning Japanese in order to interrogate Japanese POWs, translate Japanese military documents, and break Japanese military codes. In 1940s wartime America, the notion of trustworthy and intellectually brilliant personnel for an elite non-combat military unit equal white men, preferably from elite universities, or, as in the case of Fiedler, members of Phi Beta Kappa. Initially, Hindmarsh himself interviewed and recruited most of the future Boulder boys as they came to be known. While it was possible to find brilliant white students and turn them in to prepare and able translators and code breakers after 14 months of intense Japanese instruction following the Naganuma method, it was nearly impossible to find linguistically proficient white instructors. Consequently, Wall and her colleagues recruited Japanese-born Americans and Nisei fluent in Japanese, and literally overnight turned them into structural Japanese. When on February 9, 1942, President Roosevelt instituted an Executive Order 1966, which authorized military commanders to exclude civilians from military areas, the long sedimented anti-Japanese sentiment on the West Coast that the attack on Pearl Harbor further exacerbated, turning to hysteria, thus opening the gate for the forced relocation and guarded investment of West Coast Japanese and Japanese Americans. On March 29, 1942, under the authority of Roosevelt Executive Order, Lieutenant General John L. DeWitt issues Public Proclamation Number 4, which began the forced evacuation and detention of Japanese Americans, West Coast residents, on a 48-hour notice. I just took a tour of the library, and there's a reproduction of this order by this colonel. In just about 6 months, some 122,000 Japanese Americans, more than half of them citizens, were isolated and interned in the camps. Understandably, the school was forced to relocate too. Boulder was selected as a new site where the school was attached to the university campus. Wall only two moved to Colorado to serve as the school's director, a role she held until September 1944, when she was forced to return to Berkeley because of health issues that proved insurmountable only 2 years later. When he got off the train in Boulder, age 26, Leslie Aaron Fiedler was an assistant professor of English at then Montana State University in Missoula. With him were his pregnant wife, Margaret Shipley, and their 4-year-old son, Kurt. The family would welcome a new member, Eric, into the world about a month after their arrival in the Western state in January 1943. Upon being commissioned in May 1944, Fiedler was assigned to the Intelligence Center Pacific Asian area in Honolulu, which Admiral Nimitz, then Commander-in-Chief in the Pacific, headed. According to historian Roger Dingman, it was, quote, the most effective intelligence center for the war against Japan, end quote. The unit did not allow wives to live with their husbands. Therefore, after post-graduation brief return to Newark, New Jersey, where Fiedler's parents lived and Margaret decided to stay with her boys, Leslie headed west to Hawaii via San Francisco, where he spent about 2 weeks waiting for his transfer papers and undertaking some medical, swimming, and warfare tests. He would stay in Honolulu from June 1944 until the beginning of February 1945, when he volunteered for a series of missions in the Pacific that culminated at Iwo Jima. He returned to Honolulu at the beginning of April, where he remained until July, when he was transferred to Guam, the Pacific island U.S. forces had reconquered from the Japanese the previous August, and where in January Nimitz had moved his headquarters to follow more closely the Pacific campaign, supposedly waiting to be part of the invasion of Japan. The invasion, of course, never happened. Simply and somewhat cruelly but factually put, Fiedler was one of the many beneficiaries of the 2 atomic bombs dropped on Japan. Possibly those bombs prolonged his life. Certainly they extended his service in the Pacific. In early September, the war officially over, Fiedler was shipped to Tianjin in northern China, attached to the Marines' 5th Division, a unit of the 3rd Amphibious Corps, to help repatriate more than 500,000 Japanese POWs. In early December, after a rather adventurous trip, he landed for one last time that year in Honolulu, which he left finally to return home the day after Christmas. As soon as the couple left Boulder, they started their daily correspondence. Except for 2 very brief letters that Margaret wrote to Fiedler, what is left of the epistolary are her husband's letters, which unfortunately give us, if not an entirely one-sided view of the war experience, certainly an amputated one in some respect. For many years, Fiedler kept the letters in the attic of his big house in Mount Buffalo, where he taught at the local university. Unfortunately, in 1995, the fire that burned down his home also burned a good chunk of the handwritten letters, mostly from the early part of 1945. A few others survived and are not readable, except for a couple of paragraphs. Fortunately, the vast majority, 423 to be precise, remain intact. Fiedler wrote them on stationary paper with ink pens from the various locations where he found himself. Jeffrey Berman correctly points out that this means that his letters were unrevised. Additionally, because of his special military status and the kind of work he was involved in, all the letters until September 5, 1945, had to pass the Navy censorships, as the stamp on their envelopes indicates. Furthermore, all the language officers had to take an oath of secrecy that would bind them for the rest of their life, and that, to the credit and the military refined understanding of human psychology, the officer upheld. In a way, censorship is what dictates the content of the letters and fuels the aforementioned self-discovery and transformation, as it forced Fiedler to talk about anything except what he was doing for 8 hours a day, the essential reason why he was in the war. In a very concrete sense, then, the content of the letter is the result of his war experience by way of negation. To put it differently, the letters are an essential modern experience, one that forced the young literary humanist to address, at least until the official end of the conflict, primarily what he was not doing during the war. And he did so in a geographical, cultural, historical, political, and the level of basic everyday life negotiations, human context, that the war determined in every single aspect. It is one thing to read Moby Dick in the comfort of one's home or in a library. It's a whole different story to read the book in the middle of the Pacific Ocean aboard the USS Coleman on the way to China for a military mission against a non-white enemy. At the same time, somebody who was used to addressing large classrooms, predominantly full of young white boys, at a public university in the west of the United States, had an audience of one, a woman. Margaret was younger than he was by a couple of years, politically savvy, and unlike most women at the time, formally educated. Her life experience included acquaintance with the environment of the Jewish underworld of Cleveland. Obviously, she was also a wife and a mother of 2 kids. This is the context of these letters, the experiences, the chronicle. Whatever Fiedler describes, comments on, observes, and criticizes, he relates it to a woman who lives in a different life, in a different world, geographically as well as materially. It is something of which he is acutely aware, and that triggers his writing. If an epistle is, among other things, a form of one's psyche opening by way of written communication to another person, however private this opening might be, here this is twice the case. The writer, albeit a mature adult, is forced to share himself, a context, and a set of people whose life the world determines, armed with very limited life experience. Moreover, his life experience very little in common with a universe that was entirely new to him and his fellow language officers. In his 1969 autobiographical book called Being Busted, Fiedler recalls how before the war he had never seen the Pacific Ocean. The limited life experience is on display in various passages, often accompanied by a tone that is not immune to ethnic prejudice, a genuine patriarchal attitude that occasionally borders on sexism, not uncommon in Jewish young men who grew up in 1920s and 30s America, and a rigidity in established gender roles. Yes, I'm aware that this is also early 1940s in the United States, the time of Sinatra filming The House I Live In, when Americans hated the Japanese more than they hated Hitler, and Jim Crow was alive and well. It was a time when that kind of language was common parlance, and those structures of thoughts, reflective of established economic structures too, were prevalent in most quarters across ethnic and racial lines. To an extent, Fiedler acknowledges this, at least on two occasions. First, on August 1st, 1944, when he describes an unplanned visit to a church he walked by in Honolulu. He writes to Margaret, quote, "Of my sins, my inadequacy, my illiteracy at the self-examination locked into me, laced by my customary habits of reticence and self-deceit. Marianism in all its forms is alien to me. This infinitely gentle Jewish in all reputed appearances, to the Indian as Indian, the peasant girl as the beautiful lady with silver roses on her shoes. She has never uttered a word of chastisement or reproach. With her capacity for sorrow, I cannot comprehend," end quote. A second time on November 24, 1944, when he asked Margaret to give the kids, quote, "an extra show of affection that I perhaps would have been too busy or too possessed by masculinity to expand," end quote. It is also crucial to be mindful of the special position in which Fiedler found himself as a Jewish serviceman during World War II stationed in the Pacific rather than in Europe. The war gave visibility to many ethnic groups of the late 19th and early 20th century immigration to the United States. This was even more true for Jewish Americans who lacked an established military tradition, and traditions were associated with intellectual life rather than a physical one, whether labor or otherwise. Well over 500,000 Jewish Americans of a population of about 4 million, 2 of them living in the greater New York, New Jersey area, served in the war. Military service provided for Jews a passport to acceptance as true Americans, although we might do well to keep in mind that this in turn also meant acquiring at least some of the privileges of whiteness. Still, Fiedler himself experienced his fair share of prejudice and discrimination, both growing up as well as in the military, where anti-Semitism was hardly a rarity, and his whiteness protected him to a point. It is no coincidence that the colleagues he bonded and shared private spaces with were almost invariably Jewish. At the same time, there was a significant difference between serving in Europe and the Pacific for a Jewish individual. The Pacific equaled Japan, the enemy responsible for Pearl Harbor, and the United States finally entering the war, had viciously attacked and killed Americans in their country. Yet, Hirohito was no Hitler, and Japan was not pursuing the final solution, which by the time Fiedler rolled in the Navy was common knowledge. Jewish American roots and some of the Jewish soldiers' family were in Europe, not in Japan. Most Jewish American soldiers were 1 or 2 generations removed from the centuries-old history of Europeans. Fiedler was one of them. In the Pacific, Deborah Deschmoor pointed out, Jews fought as Americans. In Europe, they fought as Americans and Jews. Naturally, Nazis provided them with an extra motivation to serve and understandably to kill the enemy. For Jews, Leah Garrett wrote, a war in Europe meant, quote, the salvation of Jewish life in Europe, end quote. In this sense, Jewish soldiers in the European front experienced the war differently than their counterparts in the Pacific. Fiedler was well conscious and directly touched by all this. His younger brother Harold was fighting with the US Army in Europe. If this were not enough, the news reminded him of the extent of European anti-Semitism, which reached paradoxical, even absurd, yet tragically explainable levels. On June 5, 1945, for example, he tells Margaret, quote, my other disturbing experience was a newspaper clipping that somebody had carried to work with him. Its topography looked like the New York Times, and he told of 2,000 released French prisoners who had been held in Nazi POW camps, some of them for as long as years. On their return to Paris, they rioted in the public streets, breaking into raiding clothing stores, and crying, of all things in the world, death to the Jews, down with the Jews. The outstanding success of Nazi propaganda, the basic hunger for its attitudes that seem to lie in wait at the heart's dark core, depresses one, end quote. Nonetheless, service in the Pacific for a Jewish soldier presented its negative specificity too, reminding one of his position and identity with American society and culture. On September 12, 1945, in Guam, Fiedler laments that he is able to know the Jewish calendar with its festivities solely because a Jewish colleague has arrived from the States and has confirmed his guesses. Quote, I learned from him that Rosh Hashanah had been the 7th and the 8th of this month, with Yom Kippur to come the 17th. I have had a vague feeling of the presence of the high holidays. I have been unable to pin down the exact date, end quote. While Christian services were offered on any ship he sailed on, no such a thing was easily available to Jewish soldiers. The 5th Marine Division that Fiedler was with in the Pacific had only one Jewish chaplain, the first such chaplain the Marine Corps ever appointed, Rabbi Roland D. Gilson. And when Fiedler and a fellow Jew attempted to cross the racial line, they are now reciprocated. Quite the contrary, as soon as they approached, the black sailors enlarged their eyes to share some music in a jukebox in an alley in Honolulu. The latter leave because they are convinced that interracial spaces are forbidden, or it is preferable to avoid them. Or perhaps, given our racial history, and possibly their own personal experience, because they fear sharing spaces with whites, especially Navy officers. Although Hegel has never been especially popular in our country, one must remember there is no contradiction in holding two opposite ideas in mind at once. One can read the letters exactly in this perspective and realize how, as Fiedler gets physically outside the United States and its inwardly bent war environment, as he moves forwards in time and outward in space, so do his comments on and evaluations of people and context. He leaves behind his biases and increasingly opens toward the unknown and the other, to the point that after only a couple of weeks in China, he writes to Margaret that he regrets making disparaging comments about the Chinese, and observes that the Japanese are not what he calls symbolic enemies. Similarly, in the absence of Western faces, he realizes, quote, the immense solitude of being white and alien, yet this makes all clearer in the end the ineffable line that binds us all human, and forces me to bow into my obligation to love these people, end quote. Such a statement amounts to nothing short of an ongoing liberation that the physical and cultural encounter with and recognition of the enemy fueled. His self-liberation rests on two foundational pillars. The first is his humanistic background, which especially in the first few months he confronts critically in the letters, as if he were sounding off his thoughts on an aesthetic assessment on a variety of themes, authors, and works, both contemporaries and old. They range from Graham Greene and W.H. Auden to Greek tragedy, the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, a major influence on Fiedler, and the previously mentioned Moby Dick. In the first few months in Hawaii, though not solely, the letters became partly an occasion for an exercise in literary criticism or intellectual history. They even turned into long critical reflection on Milton, T.S. Eliot, Aldous Huxley, and Walt Whitman. They become a conversation with and about us others. They speak to both his talent for the art of criticism as well as omnivorous intellectual curiosity. Fiedler's knowledge in the Western humanistic tradition at age 26 is gigantic. It is only matched by its variety. It includes an intimate knowledge of, say, the godfather of modern poetry, T.S. Eliot, as well as obscure 16th century poets and poetic movements, modern American dance, 17th century harpsichord players, contemporary popular literature, jazz bands, and blues singers. Likewise, his critical voice exudes an authority that is not typical of a young scholar in the making. One may or may not agree with his views, but there's no denying that they are always engrossing, sharp, and brilliant. It is in these letters that he found his critical voice and started to refine his writing style. Take, for example, the infamous beginning of Come Back to the Rough Again in Honey, where Fiedler writes, quote, "It is perhaps to be expected that the Negro and the homosexual should become stock literary themes in a period when the exploration of responsibility and failure has become again a primary concern of our literature. It is not without significance that the shrug of the shoulder, the acceptance of circumstances as sufficient excuse, the sign of self-pardon before the inevitable lapse, seems in America unfamiliar, an alien gesture," end quote. Compare this beginning to these lines from June 10, 1945, letter, quote, "It is perhaps our eternal sense of the adversary presence that makes our every gesture, the leap of the cheerleader, the feint of the boxer, the hand raised to the yawn, a confession, a start of guilt. The Negro is black. There's your simple beginning, the old deep ineradicable yin and yang of us all. Black, white, good, bad, day, night. Why be subtle about it? Our history represents, in a sense, this is not about, please, to Hitler, a triumph of light people. The enemy was dark, the unknown, black," end quote. I would even contend that because he's writing to a woman from outside the United States, what is essentially an American colony, Hawaii, the young scholar and teacher who is constantly exposed to racism at home and abroad eventually comes to terms with certain strains of his own background and attitudes. It is unsurprising, I think, that shortly after the war he would become the first critic to put race and sexuality squarely at the center of American literary culture, with the very many repercussions that this critical move implies, beginning with their interaction with the class struggle. This same humanistic knowledge is what in China triggers interest in the woodprints of the great Japanese artist Utamaro, as well as in the booklet titled How the Red Army Fights, which becomes the object of a ferocious close reading turning to class-based critique of Stalinism. The second pillar of Fiedler's trajectory is his committed belief in democracy, which is one and the same with his humanism, the flip side of the same coin. His is a genuine way of understanding democracy, one rooted in and emanating from the everyday life of the demos, a very much 1930s kind of approach to democracy, where it belongs, which incidentally is what makes democracy at once the most preferable and just form of organizing a society, and complicated, susceptible to moments of difficult but perhaps necessary turmoil. It's Kratos. Democracy is for Fiedler a guiding principle, and while recognizing the unicity of the American experience in the Western world does not equal American exceptionalism. Rather, Fiedler politics grounded in the understanding of how class division, poverty, racism, imperialism, and colonialism guide different powers, whether Nazi Germany and the liberal United States, the then Soviet Union, Imperial Japan, or the Chinese Communist Party on its way to taking over China. In Hawaii, he learns to realize that he's living among what he calls, quote, a conquered people, end quote. His anti-Stalinism is everywhere in the letters, well before it would become the central issue in the political and cultural debate of the 1950s. In China, he writes to Margaret that war trials, if they must be had, should include the Americans, a position that then, as today, would earn him the ire, not the hatred, of most of his fellow Americans, especially those who never fought, let alone volunteer in a war to defend at least some semblance of democracy and freedom. He is against the persecution of the Japanese, the enemy who attacked Pearl Harbor, and almost successfully dropped bombs on the USS Auburn while he was aboard at Iwo Jima. He condemns the Chinese communists who use poverty as a tool for power with no respect for human dignity. Concomitantly, he sees the Chinese theater an analogy with a minstrel show. Back in Honolulu, after living in China, he shows class solidarity with native Islander bus drivers. He even allies himself as a Jew with a Levantine heritage with the Muslims and the blacks, without overlooking his privileged status as a U.S. naval officer and his advantageous whiteness. Even his gender rigidity gives way to his disgusting resentment for the abusive sex of American officers in China. In this respect, his view of and the relationship he developed with the Japanese is especially telling. Even more so because of the complicated relationship between Americans and Japanese at the time, obviously. I recalled already the US government racist and dehumanizing treatment of Japanese and Japanese American and how Pearl Harbor and wholly added fuel to the pre-existing racial hatred toward Asian Americans and Japanese. Obviously, Fiedler was aware of this. After all, he had the advantage of more than a year spent daily with and learning from Japanese and Japanese Americans in Boulder. They were as Americans as Fiedler was. They only looked different than he did, just like to their eyes, he looked different than they were. Nonetheless, theirs and their parents' country of origin's racial history was not much better than the United States. George Orwell even wrote that for centuries Japan espoused, quote, a racial theory even more extreme than that of the Germans, end quote. The Japanese culture of self-immolation materialized in the kamikaze attacks by Japanese suicide squadrons, which Fiedler witnessed firsthand at Iwo Jima. They were widely reported by American war reporters and only exacerbated the Americans' negative view of the Japanese. Likewise, it is the brutal, inhuman way in which the Japanese treated civilians, which, as he wrote in February 1945 from Okinawa, included a widespread rape of women and the use of children to lure American soldiers into homes rigged with bombs. Fiedler witnessed firsthand the consequences of this treatment. On February 19, 1945, he wrote to Margaret from Saipan, quote, "This day, Reed and I set off for the stockade to, as the Japanese say, play, visit genially with the remnants of the band that on this island killed their children, cut their stomachs or throats according to their sex," end quote. Well, then this letter establishes the nucleus of the aforementioned democratic freedom that lies at the heart of Fiedler's identity as an intellectual and an American. This democratic freedom allows him to change his own tendency to opinionate or judge people and cross the cultural border and close the gap with the other, which unsurprisingly unfolds entirely as Fiedler arrives in Tianjin in northern China. There, he writes, finally understand the meaning of victory when he encounters a local, a Russian woman. Quote, "There was a little blonde Russian woman next to me. Suddenly she was crying with little animal sobs. 8 years, she said over and over, I'm happy. A few minutes later, she turned to me shyly and said, let me shake your hand. I was for the first time touched, had some real sense of the meaning of victory beyond the provocation of two zads, and the simple relief of being able to talk of the end," end quote. In a rather concrete sense, his humanism and commitment to democracy are what allowed him to survive. They allowed him to go through the war without paying the ultimate price, which of course is not death, but to hate the enemy. The same person who states that he does not believe in pacifism and volunteered to defeat Nazism, write to his Jewish wife and son that, quote, "It is permitted us to kill the enemies, but not to hate them, to love or hate, to be proud of the love," end quote. His literary culture and his commitment to what he calls real democracy ultimately protected him from hating the enemy as the other, or, which is the same, they protected him from hating himself. No wonder that, and after a few days back in Hawaii in December 1945, the war over, he tells Margaret that he went to church. Quote, "I like the warm, humane, gaudy place, Margaret, like the absurd Eastern at the rail, where the collection, the Negro, the Philippines, the wave, the shop girl, the improper blonde sailor surrender to the only democracy that is not a hoax of a mere programmatic item," end quote. a gesture that aligns diversity, class, and the freedom to believe with democracy. In that moment, this Jewish American serviceman feels the need to be with the others, in a place where, theoretically speaking, everyone is welcome, where everyone is free to own his or himself, where everyone is at home. A few days later, on Christmas Day, he is finally in the ship to start straight to his physical home. Aboard the USS Dayan, he talks about Christmas and the story of the Nativity. Rhetorically speaking, he does so in a crude, even violent way, as he imagines a different graphic version of the Nativity. It's a tough passage to read, to say the least. There is an enraged cynicism, even a vulgar meanness in it. While it might be understandable given the utter psychological breakdown he was experiencing, I doubt he would be proud of it if he could read it again. Nonetheless, even then, he cannot bring himself to let hate prevail. Instead, he closes by writing his Jewish family, quote, "Merry Christmas. I wish only I had been there to read you all the story out of the Bible, and perhaps it's a Renaissance poem." And that's the end too, on my paper. Thank you.
So we have time for questions and answers. There we go.
Yes.
Yeah, your story, reminds me of the story my father was telling me. When he was behind the German lines and fighting in Germany, and there were instances where the U.S. commanders did not want to take prisoners, and they would assign people to execute
Please.
prisoners. My father refused, absolutely refused, threatened with court-martials, but he believed in his values. He wasn't a pacifist, but like I said, he believed in a certain standard of decency.
Yes.
He was always reading, always bringing his books to the front. And he wound up with the Bronze Star after that. So I think, I just how, the experience of that sort of war, like in person every day,
Yes.
brings you to that sort of humanism perspective, because it's so overwhelming in the brutality that you kind of come to this instinctual notion that whatever is going on, like something's wrong with mass killing of ordinary
Absolutely.
people. You know what I'm saying?
And it's concrete.
Yeah.
It's there every day. It's not an abstraction that you read in books or novels, debate philosophically about the meaning and the nature of war. It's there every day. And it's not just the killing. It's being able to take a shower, being divided according to ethnic groups, racial groups, So you see all these, every little aspects of life that they become more and more, meaningful to you, and they tell you some sort of truth about who you are, right? And if you give yourself up to this reality, and you become just as guilty as the opponent, who is the real guilty one in the end, right? And obviously coming from a humanistic background helps. Okay? But the interesting thing I discovered doing this work, because I'm not an historian, I'm a literary critic, I teach literature, as you probably figure out by the talk. Okay? I'm not I know my history, right? But I'm not a historian by training. But one thing I discovered is that soldiers in World War II read like crazy. Everybody. There's one of the letters in which he makes almost fun of, is in one of the ships that they're taking it to Iwo Jima, and the Auburn, and he says, this is like the Library of Congress, everybody's reading, and he said, this is reading this is people who never, read a book. Now, instead of being a war, it seems like we are training for a PhD exam of some sort, right? He makes fun of it. But it's true, right? And I think he does. And there was a deliberate effort, I found now, having, these guys read it. They were buy libraries or people donated books of all sorts to, And the other thing is that you didn't have a choice in what you wanted to read, right? So whatever was there, like in an office or on a ship or, you know, whatever you put in your backpack, you know, I mean, you pick it up and read it. So whether it's Moby Dick or like, you know, Tritium, you know, Wittgenstein Tritium language, because it's there, you just read it, you know, or whatever magazine is there, and so on and so forth. That's a very interesting aspect of how soldiers experience. It would be interesting, I don't know if there's any study done, but how soldiers experience reading during World War II and what that did for them, for example. They certainly don't do it these days, right? See the consequences too, I guess.
Maybe one more quick. You good?
So thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.